Hi, I'm Enda Murray. I'm the director of the Irish Film Festival, and I'm really delighted to have Emer Reynolds, director of Phil Lynnett's Songs for While I'm Away. Emer, lovely to have you join us tonight. Tell us, how did you become involved in the Phil Lynott documentary?
I was approached by Alan Maher, one of the film's producers, around about the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, when my last film, The Farthest, was just kind of finishing its cinema promotions kind of run, and he had been a fan of that film and had heard that I was a Phil Lynott fan or a Thin Lizzy fan, and approached me about seeing would I like to come on board with him and his producers, his producing partners, who had been developing for a little while, or at least running with the idea with the Phil Lynott estate about making a film about Phil Lynott. And I was delighted immediately, very, very interested, nearly bit his arm off. And yeah, it started there. I wrote a proposal, a treatment for the sort of film I'd like to make. And they were loving that. You know, it was syncing very nicely with what they were thinking. So we started, finishing or trying to raise the funds for it at that point. And, happened very quickly. I was shooting interviews by the end of that year. So that's really the beginning of my journey with this film.
Thanks. Well, congratulations. It's a marvelous film, and I think it really captures the different sides of Phil Lynott. How do you start with a documentary about somebody who is so well known and particularly in Ireland, there would be so many people who have got their Phil Lynott, not just the Phil Lynott story, but people will have their own experiences of him. Where do you start?
I mean, I don't know if it was right or wrong, but where I did start was I read everything that had been written, or most of the stuff that had been written, all the books and as many articles as I could find. I watched Tin Lizzy documentaries, and I tried to see what was out there and really tried to interrogate what I would like to see, and I was less interested in a kind of a rock doc genre. I was less interested in something that would kind of deconstruct all the albums and, go through the song playlist. I was more interested in, a poetic portrait of a human and, pitched that as what I wanted to see. So I think you're right. People think they know him, they know about Lizzie, they know lots of anecdotes. And we were trying to maybe get under that a little, that even I, as a huge fan, I think what I had known or what I thought I had known was much less than what I discovered as I started to research it. I had certainly fallen for the image, the big sexy rocker, the hair dipping down over his eye, the cheeky grin, the legs that went on forever, the way he posed with the guitar, and this incredibly charismatic and confident frontman with his sexy voice and his incredible lyrics. So I had definitely tucked in behind that as him. And then you start to talk to his friends and his family, you start to listen to interviews, and actually what you discover is, a much more complex story. And I think it's true of us all. We're one of the taglines I used to have over my desk when I was researching it was, that I'm trying to remember the name of the poet who wrote it, about we contain multitudes, that idea that he's Walt Whitman. Yeah, that there's many layers to him, not just the one I could see. And even, for example, finding out how shy he was as a young boy, how shy he was when Lizzie first started, how reluctant he was to be the front man, to step out and own that part of the stage, that responsibility that he had to be the face of it and he had to be the image. Finding, that reluctance, that was really interesting to me. And so really wanting to do something a little bit more intimate, a little bit more personal, a little bit more surprising. And the big hook we found was the idea of allowing Philip, sadly no longer with us, we weren't able to do an interview, all that having to live with all of that. trying to find a way to tell his story as firsthand as we could, to allow him to tell his own story if we at all could. And really the only way to do that was, there was three ways to do it. One was to get close to his friends and family, maybe people who knew him really well, not to bring people into the mix that were just rock journos or commentators, musical gurus, to actually talk to his friends, talk to his daughters, talk to people who knew him as a person, first and foremost. Then secondly, we dug into hundreds of hours of audio archive, interviews he'd done all over the place, stuff that wasn't very well known, in an attempt to find a voice for him, a voice maybe you'd never heard before. And that was tough enough because he was incredibly adept at keeping private, interestingly. He would do interviews and he was happy enough to talk about the albums and the tours and anecdotes about, stuff that happened on tour, but not very good at talking about himself and about the work and about the lyrics and about, his process. So really finding that was a big journey. But then the third and biggest route we went to try to let him speak for himself was to tell his life through the songs. And that was a real door opening for me, a way that we could suddenly, here he was telling you his inner thoughts, or pretending his inner thoughts, or putting a spin on something that had happened. So the songs became this incredible window into his inner life and his journey. And that became the structure for the film, to allow the songs themselves tell you his story.
Yeah, I can see just reading some of the interviews that people have picked up on that the songs are front and center. I just wanted to come back. You mentioned about Phil Lynott being shy as a young guy, and it could not have been very easy growing up in Ireland in the 50s and 60s, being black. What was the impact that you found on him, being one of the very few black people in Ireland at the time?
I mean, it's a really interesting part of this story, because it's actually very hard to find him. He wrote very little about being black. He spoke very little about being black. Even his widow, Caro, said he reflected on it very little. He did seem to have, his friends in Crumlin talk almost like it was not an issue. He was just a black man in the middle of Dublin and he didn't really see it as otherness. However, I don't think that was quite the story. It just seems to me that can't have really been true. And they were in fights. They talk in the film about getting into scraps when he was in school. He felt like probably the only black child in the whole of Ireland. So it was, I think had he lived towards the end of his life, he was starting to work with more black musicians. He was looking into songwriting and working with other black musicians. I think it seems to me, and this is just my perspective, it seems to me that as he was getting older, he was starting to become as interested in that part of his identity as his Irish identity, which he had worn so strongly and so closely, became like the quintessential Irishman. It does seem to me that he had started to unpack his blackness towards the end of his life. And perhaps if he had lived, we'd know more about that now. We'd have seen, a black man starting to understand what the effects on it was of him growing up in a, as you know, from Dublin in the 60s, 70s, 80s, whenever you left, incredibly monochrome kind of culture at that point, which it isn't now, thankfully. And, there's, it would have been really fascinating to see him still here now with, the black voices and the mixed race voices that are emerging on the Dublin scene now.
Yeah, and you mentioned about his pride in being Irish, and there are a couple of great clips in the film where he pulls people up, and they kind of dismiss it, and then he stops them and says, "No, Republic of Ireland, it's very important." Where do you think that came from?
he was the quintessential Irish. Jerome Rimson says in the film he was always more Irish than any Irishman I ever met. I think it was an identity he embraced and totally absorbed. It gave him structure. It gave him confidence. People don't realize he wasn't born in Ireland. He was born in England. He came to Ireland at age 7. He had a Brummie accent when he arrived. So in many ways, because he came to Crumlin into a very loving family and a very supportive community, it became who he was, or who he really felt at home being. His Dublin accent, within weeks he had a strong Dublin accent, an accent that he never lost. You hear his accent. He was living in London, he was touring the world, but he still had this very powerful Dublin accent. So I think he really clung to his Irishness as a defining feature of who he really was, and was incredibly interested in Irish history and Irish mythology, wrote in a way, Irish poetry. He was really, it's gorgeous to see that somebody could move here at 7 and then really, embrace it so fully. And we have more interviews talking about the complexity of that. I think he was a little, one note maybe about it, a nationalist. He had a real identity that was quite simple about Ireland, and maybe if he had lived as well, that would have developed over time too.
Yeah, it was nice to see Jim Fitzpatrick, someone I hadn't seen for a while, and I remember back in the day, that the art of Jim Fitzpatrick was a great nod to Ireland's mythical past. Yeah, and I think it was Johnny the Fox, maybe, that album cover. For someone that seemed to have so much going for him, why do you think he developed such a damaging dependency on substances?
That's a difficult question for me to answer in terms of speaking for him, but yeah. I think a lot about it in terms of, that old Irish saying about "there, but for the grace of God go I." I think if I had been at age 20, 23, plunged into this incredibly adventurous world of touring America with Queen and Bachman Turner Overdrive, and you're on the road, and it's the 70s and everyone's taking drugs, just as fun, maybe not really understanding the darkness that was waiting down the road. Or I just think they were just having the crack, and I think it could have happened to me too, that feeling of not really, like that the same year that Lizzie broke up, Scott Gorham, who was also very badly dependent on heroin, he got clean and sorted his life out and is still clean and happily away from that life. And Philip went left and Scott went right. And I think that could happen to any of us, so I don't know why. I just think it's really understandable. And I think, if he had lived through that little phase, he was definitely talking a lot about getting clean. He was getting help. He was in and out of rehab. I think maybe he could have just gone through that little patch and he might have outrun it, and wouldn't that have been something to behold?
Yeah. Just moving kind of back, what was the difference in in making The Farthest, and the topic being an inanimate object, but what were the things that you've learned from going from there to Phil Lynott? What were the biggest differences? Or
some of it was the same, really. I took a similar approach in the sense of humanity, like I had these, I still have them up over my desk in my office: humanity, heart, humor, honesty. Like I really feel that there's a true line. I'm not very cynical. I don't conduct the interviews in a way that I'm trying to dig and reveal, and I can find something out about somebody that you don't want to tell me. I get to know all my interviewees on both The Farthest and on Songs for While I'm Away. I want to get to know the people I'm going to talk to. I want them to trust me. I want to build a friendship and a rapport, and really be very respectful and allow them the dignity and to be understand that it's a privilege to talk to people and to understand. So then the main difference between The Farthest, as you say, being a spacecraft that is gone out in space and inanimate, and Philip was feeling the responsibility and the weight of it being about a real person, and honoring a real person's life, and that was an incredible privilege for me, but also a huge responsibility. In fact, Adam Clayton, when I interviewed him, quite gently and kindly said to me, it is a big responsibility. And I felt that very keenly all the time. And also, not just towards Philip, but towards the contributors in the film who were trusting me with their story of his story, that everybody, we were all very trying to be incredibly respectful of how hard it is to talk about your long dead friend or your father who's died in such tragic circumstances. And I wanted to offer Philip's story and Philip's friends and family a huge amount of compassion and tenderness and respect in the telling of that story. And I was very clear about that. And I'm really happy with that decision. And I'm very proud that the film reflects that kind of honesty and simplicity, perhaps, and tenderness, tenderness towards him.
Yeah, I think it does come across. Yeah, very much. Just tell us a little bit about what you brought with you from your editing days. You got, I went down with Paddy Brannock and Brendan Gleeson, and then 1 Million Dubliners, which was when I saw that film in Galway. It was just a beautiful film. What do you take as a filmmaker from your days as an editor into your directing role?
I definitely benefit hugely as a filmmaker from my years as an editor, because the editor's strongest tool, biggest skill is storytelling. That everything, and you say I cut narrative features, I cut feature docs. I was, as an editor, I was across all the codes for over 20 years, and learning, working with incredible directors and scriptwriters and incredible material, and really learning and honing that art of storytelling, how to communicate. And over that time, I think as an editor and then transitioning into directing, being able to ask those questions, and I still ask them very clearly when I'm doing interviews, when I'm shooting the visual material, when I'm developing. I've just directed a feature drama, my first feature drama, finished shooting 2 weeks ago. But I ask the same questions all the time that I would have asked as an editor. Where's the heart of this story? How do I tell this story? And then I think on the negative, or on the other side, as a director, I consciously tried to not be the editor. I tried to think I'm going to just fly a bit free and, follow my instincts, even if I don't know where they're going, and allow things to be a little messy, and trust very much that the edit, and I have an incredible editor, Tony Cranston, that I'm working with on all my films, that the edit will do what it needs to do after the chaos maybe, or the exploration, or the madness of a shoot, that the edit then will, I have great trust in the editing process. So they're the two big things I bring, and I'm really grateful for them.
Great. What looking back now, what was the most enjoyable thing for you in making the Phil Lynott doco?
It was a bit of meeting some of my heroes. Meeting Eric Bell was incredible. Meeting Scott Gorham. I'm a proper Lizzie fan. I was at the last Lizzie gig in the RDS in 1983. The last Irish gig. Stood there with the lighter on, the lit lighter, and cried through "Still in Love with You." So I was your proper ordinary everyday fan. So I was a little fangirly when Scott walked into the interview room and was telling me all the inside stories. So that was incredibly special for me. I had never seen Lizzie as the three-piece So I'd never seen Eric live, but you know, very thrilled to meet him and to hear his stories of the early days. So that was really enjoyable, meeting all the people who knew him well, and kind of peeping behind the mask a little, you know, getting under Philip's skin a little through his close friends and family.
Yeah. You mentioned you've just been working on another your first feature drama. What can you tell us what you're doing at the moment? So
sure, I just finished shooting it. I've started editing with Tony again. It's a narrative feature called Joyride, which is written by a gorgeous Irish writer, Kerry-based writer called Alva Keoghan. And we finished it. We shot it for 5 weeks in Kerry, all around Kerry. Finished 2 weeks ago, and it's wonderfully, incredibly, starring Oscar winner Olivia Colman. And it's a kind of a road movie. It's a big-hearted, wickedly funny road movie about Joy, who is played by Olivia, and she's on a kind of a oddball little road trip with a 13-year-old boy racer who's a little guy called Charlie Reid, who's a brand new talent, playing a character called Mully. And yeah, we just finished, as I said, 2 weeks ago. We just finished the assembly now, and we're into the edit, and that'll be the rest of this year.
Fantastic. Thanks a million for taking the time from your very busy schedule. And yeah, congratulations again on the film. I thoroughly enjoyed it as a Phil Lynott fan. So maybe next year we might get the new film. Yes, maybe even get you over to Australia. Thanks a million.
Thank you so much. I hope your audience enjoy it. Thank you so much. Bye.